Sutter's Crossing, the grain elevator at the edge of town, had been the economic center of the Willamette Valley's Eastern Plateau farming district since 1958, a concrete tower visible for 20 miles in any direction, the place where the harvest came in and the money came out, and the year's work translated into the number that determined whether a family farm survived another season or whether the quiet conversation with the bank had the ending that farm families in the American West have been having with banks since farming began. For 31 years, the elevator and its adjoining commodity brokerage had been operated by a man named Brent Callister, who had taken over from his father in 1992 and who had built over 3 decades a reputation as the most trusted and most knowledgeable agricultural commodities operator in the district. A man who knew the futures, markets, and the insurance regulations and the USDA grading standards with the comprehensive fluency of someone who had grown up breathing wheat dust and who understood more deeply than the farmers who grew the grain understood it themselves, the technical infrastructure that translated a harvest into money. What Brent Callister had also understood for at least 20 of those 31 years was that the technical infrastructure he controlled so completely was invisible to the people who depended on it, and that its invisibility was exploitable, and that the exploitation, if structured correctly, would be impossible to detect without the kind of coordinated cross-referencing that 31 years of trust would prevent anyone from thinking to do. The investigation that unraveled his operation in the spring of 2023 produced eventual financial forensics report documenting a cumulative fraud of approximately $4.1 million, skimmed in annual increments too small to trigger individual alarm from more than 200 farm operations across a 20-year period. It also produced a secondary finding that the financial investigators had not been looking for, and that the criminal charges eventually had to accommodate alongside the fraud 3 families who had filed crop insurance claims in years when their harvests had been graded below the quality threshold for maximum insurance payout. Claims that the insurance company had partially denied on the basis of quality grades provided by Callister's brokerage, grades that the investigation established had been falsified to reduce payout eligibility in cases where Callister's facility would benefit from holding the grain longer at a price favorable to the broker rather than the farmer, a finding that turned a commodity fraud case into something that the farm families of Sutter's Crossing described as a betrayal so complete and so fundamental that they did not have a clean category for it. Because the person who had betrayed them had been, for 30 years, the person they trusted most with the thing they cared about most, which was the question of whether the work of the year had been enough. The investigation began with a drought. The summer of 2022 was the driest in the Eastern Plateau district since records began. A drought that reduced yields across the region by an average of 38%, and that compressed the financial margins of every farm in the district to the point where the question of whether the year had been enough was, for many families, a genuine and urgent question rather than the abstract annual anxiety that most years allowed it to remain. Drought years produce a specific kind of conversation among farm neighbors, comparisons of yield and price and insurance outcome that are more detailed and more candid than the conversations of better years, because the stakes are higher and the need to understand whether your experience is shared is more immediate. And because the conversation in the diner, in the feed store, in the grain elevator parking lot in a drought. Here is the conversation of people who are genuinely trying to understand whether the drought, and not something else, is the explanation for the numbers they are looking. A farmer named Dennis Howell, whose family had been growing soft white wheat on 600 acres 11 miles north of Sutter's crossing since 1949, had been having a conversation with increasing frustration through the fall of 2022 because the numbers he's looking at from Collister's elevator did not match the drought narrative in the way he would have expected. His yield, adjusted for the documented drought, was approximately what the regional extension services for his acreage and his seed variety and his soil conditions. His price per bushel was in the range the futures market suggested, but his insurance payout, based on the quality grade that Collister's brokerage had certified for his 2022 crop under the revenue protection policy he had carried since 2008, was lower than a drought year payout should have been for a crop of the measured quality, not dramatically lower, not in a way that would have stood out in any single year, but lower enough that when Dennis sat at his kitchen table with his agronomist daughter, a woman named Petra who had come home from an Oregon State Extension posting to help with the harvest, and compared his insurance documentation against the Extension Service's regional quality assessment data for that year's wheat. The grade his insurance claim rested on did not match the grade that the regional assessment suggested his wheat should have received. Petra Howell had a specific professional background for noticing this, which was 12 years of agricultural extension work focused on grain quality assessment, and she had the specific professional temperament for acting on it, which was the temperament of a person trained to investigate discrepancies between reported data and observed data, and who understood that the first discrepancy in a data series is more significant than it looks because it raises the question of how long the series has been running. She spent a week pulling together every quality grade certificate Collister's brokerage had issued to her father's operation going back 10 years, and she compared them against the Extension Service's regional quality data for the same 10 years, and she found that the pattern was not the product of the drought year alone. The quality grades on her father's crop had been running below the regional comparable data in 7 of the 10 years she examined, not in every year and not by a dramatic amount, but consistently directionally, and in years where the resulting grade reduction had had a material effect on insurance payout eligibility. She pulled the same records for 3 neighboring farms, whose operators she knew well, and who gave her access to their documentation without asking her to explain why. She wanted it because they had been having the same conversation in the same drought year context, and because Petra Howell had a professional credibility in the district that preceded her return home. The pattern was the same across all 3 farms. The quality grades in years where maximum insurance payout was available had been running below the regional comparable data. The dollar value of the difference, calculated at the crop insurance payout rates, was not large in any individual year, but it compounded across a decade and across multiple farms in a way that Petra described in the email she sent to the Oregon Department of Agriculture's Commodity Regulations Division in November of 2022. Implausible in the absence of a systematic explanation. The Oregon Department of Agriculture's Commodity Audit Division opened an inquiry within 3 weeks. A forensic agricultural economist named Vincent Park was assigned to the case and spent the first 2 months establishing whether the discrepancy could be explained by legitimate factors, including equipment calibration differences between Collister's grading instruments and the regional extension service variations, and the ordinary year-to-year variability of a single farm's relative to a regional average. He concluded, at the end of those 2 months, that none of those factors explain the size, consistency, and directionality of the discrepancy across farms in 10, and that the most parsimonious explanation for the data was a systematic quality undergrading applied to a specific subset of Collister's client accounts in years when the grading result had insurance implications. a conclusion he described in his preliminary report as law enforcement follow-up for the fraud theory it implied. The State Police Agricultural Fraud Unit, a small specialized team that handled exactly this category of case, was contacted in February of 2023. The investigation had expanded beyond quality grades to the weighing records, and the weighing records were where the full scope of Brent Collister's operation became visible. The weighing. Every bushel of grain that passes through a licensed grain elevator must be weighed on a certified scale, and the weight must be recorded on a scale ticket. That is the legal basis for the elevator's payment to the farmer. The scale ticket is the document that translates the physical harvest into money, and its accuracy is supposed to be guaranteed by the USDA's Federal Grain Inspection Service, which requires licensed elevators to maintain calibrated scales and to make their weighing records available for inspection. Brent Collister's elevator scales were, when the investigation examined them, calibrated with intolerance correctly, because Collister was meticulous about his equipment and understood that a produced obviously wrong results would be caught immediately. What the investigation found was not wrong scales, but wrong records, a secondary bookkeeping system that Collister had been maintaining for 2 decades alongside the official scale ticket system, in which the weights recorded on scale tickets for a selected group of client accounts had been adjusted downward after certification, but before the farmer received their copy, a discrepancy of between 1% and 3% per load that was too small to feel significant on a single delivery, but that, applied systematically to dozens of deliveries per farm per year, produced an annual skimming yield of between $600 and $1,500 per targeted account, multiplied across a client base of over 200 farms over 20 years. The secondary bookkeeping system was maintained on a laptop that Collister kept in a locked cabinet in his private office, a cabinet that the search warrant opened and whose contents the investigators described as the cleanest and most organized evidence of sustained fraud they had encountered, because Collister had maintained his records with the same meticulous precision that characterized everything else about his operation. 2 decades of adjusted weights, a spreadsheet that balanced to the penny against the payments to the corresponding private accounts the investigation identified in a bank in Bend, accounts whose beneficiary, once the company holding them was traced to its source, was a trust in the names of Collisters to adult children, mirroring, in its financial architecture, the Costco in Ashford County, which Collister could not have known about because the cases were in different states and the investigators were different people and the mechanisms were different, but which reflected the same instinct that apparently characterizes a certain category of long-term institutional fraud, the desire to pass the proceeds to the next generation rather than to consume them personally, as though the legacy of the theft, if it skipped a generation, became something cleaner than the theft itself. The $4.1 million. The forensic accounting reconstructed the full scope of the fraud across 20 years. A process that required examining scale tickets, payment records, bank statements, and the secondary ledger, and that produced a total figure of $4.1 million over 20 years across 214 client accounts, a number that worked out to an average of roughly $200,000 per year, roughly $900 per targeted client per year, a number so small in the annual increment that the fraud had operated precisely in the gap between what felt significant and what felt worth questioning in the context of a commodity operation where price variation of more than that amount happened naturally in the course of a normal trading week. The 3 insurance cases, alongside the weighing fraud, the quality grade manipulation, produced a secondary harm that the prosecution eventually charged separately, because its mechanism was different and its victims were specifically identifiable. In 3 cases, The quality grade reduction had crossed the threshold between reducing the farmer's insurance payout and denying it entirely, an outcome that had occurred in years, when the farm operation was financially stressed enough that the insurance payout would have been, as each of the three families described it to investigators, the difference between keeping the operation and losing it. One of those three farms had been lost. A family named the Vickers, who had farmed 400 acres of wheat and barley 15 miles east of Sutter's Crossing since 1971, had experienced a crop denial in 2019 based on a quality grade Collister's brokerage had certified as below the minimum threshold for coverage that year, a denial that their insurance agent had told them was reviewable, but that the review process, conducted under USDA protocols that relied on the certifying broker's records as the primary evidence, had upheld. The Vickers family had applied for an emergency agricultural loan, had been denied on the basis of the prior year's insurance failure, had carried the 2019 loss into 2020 and then into 2021, and had sold the farm in February of 2022, 9 months before Petra Howells sent her email to the Department of Agriculture, a corporate agricultural operation that paid them below market because the operation's recent financial record had made the property unattractive to conventional buyers. The sale price was $420,000. The farm's estimated value under normal circumstances was $680,000. The Vickers family, Gerald and Margot, in their 60s, moved into a rental house in the county seat. Gerald had a part-time job at a hardware store. Margot helped at the school cafeteria 3 days a week. They received the Attorney General's notification letter in the summer of 2023 and called the Victim Services number and were told that the investigation had identified their 2019 crop insurance denial as potentially connected to a falsified quality grade, and that the investigation would produce in the civil proceedings a claim for the economic harm attributable to the falsification. They were not told, in that call, what the complete picture of the scheme looked like, and Gerald Vickers has said since that the full understanding came to him in increments, each increment requiring a new recalibration of how long the thing had been happening and what it had been doing over that period to the lives of 200 families in the district, and understanding that, when it was finally complete, produced in him a feeling he described to the Victim Services Coordinator as something between rage and a kind of strange and vertiginous wonder at the sheer duration of it. 30 years of an elevator, 30 years of a trusted face in the district, 30 years of a man who knew their names and their fields and their yield histories, which Collister had used not as the foundation of the trust he was given, but as the detailed operational map of an extraction that the trust had made invisible. The arrest. Brent Collister was arrested at the elevator on a Tuesday morning in June of 2023, a day he had been expecting since March, when the state police search warrant had been executed and the laptop had been found and the cabinet had been opened. And when he had understood, with the specific clarity of a meticulous person who has maintained a meticulous record of something and who knows exactly what a meticulous record produces in the hands of an investigator with the right subpoena, that the question was no longer whether the investigation would reach him, but how long it would take. He had spent 3 months with his attorney preparing for the arrest, organizing his personal affairs, and doing nothing that could be construed as flight or concealment, which his attorney advised and which was consistent with Collister's character, because Collister was not a person who panicked and was not a person who ran and was, in the judgment of the investigators who arrested him, the calmest defendant they had ever processed. A calm they interpreted not as innocence, but as the specific equanimity of a man who has spent 20 years accepting that everything he was doing could be discovered, and who had decided at some point 2 decades ago that the discovery was an acceptable risk in exchange for what the scheme was producing. He was charged with 43 counts of obtaining money by false pretenses in connection with the weighing fraud, 7 counts of filing false agricultural records in connection with the quality grade manipulation, 3 counts of procurement fraud in connection with the crop insurance cases, and 1 count of criminal conspiracy. He entered a not guilty plea and was released on bail. His attorney indicated he would contest the characterization of the quality grade adjustments as fraud rather than legitimate professional judgment about grain quality, a defense that the agricultural expert witnesses the prosecution had retained described as requiring the jury to accept that one licensed broker's professional judgment had diverged from every available regional quality benchmark in the same direction in 7 of 10 consecutive years across 4 separate farm accounts. A coincidence that the prosecution's economists characterized with the same phrase Vincent Park had used in his preliminary report, which was statistically implausible in the absence of a systematic explanation. The trial lasted 3 weeks in the winter of 2023. The defense's case rested primarily on the quality grade argument, the weighing discrepancies being harder to contest given the existence of the secondary ledger on the laptop, which Collister's attorneys had no persuasive theory for other than the claim that it was a private accounting exercise whose purpose was not what the prosecution said it was, a claim that required the jury to explain to themselves what purpose a private ledger reconciling adjusted weights against payments to accounts in the names of Collister's children would otherwise serve, a question the jury apparently found unanswerable because they convicted on 39 of the 43 weighing fraud counts, all 7 quality grade counts, all 3 insurance fraud counts, and the conspiracy count. The 4 acquittals on weighing fraud reflected cases where the documentation was incomplete due to the age of the records. Brent Collister was sentenced to 27 years in Oregon State Prison. He was 68 years old. The grain elevator at the edge of Sutter's crossing was sold as part of the asset forfeiture proceedings to a cooperative formed by 32 of the district's farm operations, a cooperative whose formation had been encouraged by the Oregon Department of Agriculture as the most functional disposition of the facility, and whose governance structure included, by design, a rotating oversight committee drawn from the membership with specific authority to review and grading records quarterly against independent regional data, an authority that had not existed when the elevator was operated by a single private individual, and that existed now specifically because the thing it was designed to prevent had been allowed to operate for 20 years in the absence of exactly that kind of oversight. Dennis Howell was elected to the cooperative's first oversight
Mara Thibodeau
committee.
did not tell him he was right.
The elevator every day
She
on the
did
way
not tell him he was wrong
to his fields, and that his relationship to the building has changed in a way he finds difficult to articulate, that it is the same building and a different institution, and that the difference is both real and insufficient, because the institution being different does not make the 20 years of the institution being what it was any shorter, and that the 20 years when he allows himself to think about them fully is the number that sits the heaviest, because it is the number that represents how long the thing was running before his daughter came home from her extension posting in a drought year and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the numbers with the professional attention of someone who had been trained to notice when data and reality did not match. Petra Howell, the agricultural extension worker who had done the comparison that started the case, returned to her extension posting after the investigation and has been there since, working in a different district but maintaining a relationship with the Sutter's Crossing Cooperative through an advisory role she accepted at the cooperative's request. She has said, when asked about the case in the context of her professional work, that it changed the way she thinks about quality grade documentation and weighing records in every county where she works, that she now includes a cross-reference against regional benchmark data as a standard element of her annual farm assessment reports, and that she has found in 3 other districts across 2 years discrepancies that warranted referral to the State Commodity Audit Division, 2 of which resolved as legitimate methodological variations and 1 of which produced a separate investigation whose outcome is not yet public. She has also said, with the careful understatement of a scientist describing a personal matter in professional terms, that she thinks about the farms in the Sutter's Crossing district often, about the 20 years of harvest that passed through the elevator and came out the other side as numbers that had been adjusted by a fraction of a percent before reaching the farmers who had grown them, about what the cumulative difference of that fraction represents across 20 years of a farm family's life, and about whether there is a meaningful category for a harm so small in each individual instance and so large in aggregate, a harm distributed so widely and so thinly that its effect at the level of any single family was the chronic, grinding, barely noticeable pressure of never quite having enough, a pressure that most families attribute to the weather and the markets and the ordinary vicissitudes of agricultural economics, because those are the explanations that are true most of the time, and that were true this time to underneath the fraud, alongside the fraud, making the fraud invisible because it had such good company. The cooperative's elevator grain comes in every fall, the way it has every fall since 1958. The scales produce tickets, the tickets go in the record. The record is reviewed quarterly by the Oversight Committee and annually by an independent agricultural accountant retained by the cooperative, and the numbers are compared against regional benchmark data by a protocol that Petra Howell helped design and that the cooperative's members voted to fund because they understood, from everything the case had taught them, that the comparison is the check, and the check is the thing, and the thing that was missing for 20 years was not the data or the scale or the equipment or the expertise, but the comparison, the simple and unglamorous act of looking at one set of numbers alongside another set of numbers and asking whether they match, which they now do every quarter, and which the Oversight Committee notes in the quarterly report, and which the membership reads at the annual meeting, and which is, in the ordinary functioning of the cooperative, the most routine item on the agenda, a confirmation that the numbers are what they are supposed to be, and that the elevator is doing what the elevator was always supposed to do, which is weigh the grain honestly and certify the quality accurately and pay the farmer what the harvest is worth, which is the minimum, which was missing, which is present now, which the farmers of the Eastern Plateau District plant toward every spring and harvest toward every fall, in fields visible for 20 miles from the elevator's concrete tower, which stands at the edge of Sutter's Crossing exactly as it has stood since 1958, the same building with a different record, weighed to the right decimal, graded to the honest standard, in the hands of the people whose grain fills it, the neighbors. The 214 farm accounts that Collister's ledger documented as having been subjected to adjusted weighing over 20 years represented
willing to carry, and which parts they have decided, without ceremony and without a particular moment of decision, to set down and leave where they left them.
A practical hauling distance, and because Collister's brokerage held the only certified scale in the county, a monopoly of infrastructure that was not itself illegal or unusual in a rural agricultural district, but that had provided, in retrospect, the structural condition that made the fraud sustainable, which was the absence of a competing facility whose records could be compared against Collister's and whose independent existence would made the cross-referencing that Petra Howell performed available to anyone who thought to. In a district with 2 elevators, the discrepancy between one's records and the others would have been visible within a season. In a district with 1 elevator, the only comparison available was against external benchmark data, and the benchmark data was not something that farm families routinely assembled for their own accounts, because doing so required the kind of technical familiarity with regional quality standards that most farmers did not have and that most extension services did not specifically provide. The community's response to the investigation and the arrest was, like the community responses in every comparable case, complicated by the specific intimacy of a fraud committed by a person whose professional relationship with the victims was, in each case, a genuine relationship as well as a predatory one. Brent Collister had been to the funerals of the parents of the farmers he was defrauding. He had helped farm operations through the paperwork of drought assistance programs. He had written letters of reference for farm loans and agricultural grants. He had done all of these things honestly, because the fraud did not require him to be a bad neighbor in the visible ways, only in the invisible ones, and because being a good neighbor in the visible ways was itself part of the operational architecture of the fraud, which depended on trust that had to be continuously maintained against the possibility that someone would do what Petra Howell eventually did, which was look at the numbers from the outside. A man named Ray Farber, who had farmed adjacent to the Howell operation since the 1980s and who had known Collister since they were in the same high school class, told the victim services coordinator that the thing he kept returning to was a conversation he and Collister had had in the elevator parking lot in September of 2020, a conversation about the market outlook and the future's pricing and the insurance options for that year's crop, a conversation Ray had found helpful at the time and that he found, looking back on it from the summer of 2023, to have been a different kind of helpful than he had understood it. As in that the advice Collister had given about insurance options had been accurate and was not itself part of the fraud, but that the accuracy of the advice existed alongside the fraud in a way that Ray found he could not hold both of at once, because accepting that the advice was genuine required accepting that the man who gave it also maintained a spreadsheet in a locked cabinet that adjusted Ray's weights before his checks were written, and that those 2 facts belonged to the same person, which was true, and which was the kind of truth that 40 years of knowing someone does not prepare you to integrate. He said he thought about it every time he drove the truck to the cooperative elevator. He thought about it and he weighed the grain and he got the ticket. And he trusted the number, which was the right number now, which he had confirmed by asking Petra Howell to run the comparison for his operation in the first quarter. The cooperative was operational, which she had done, and which had shown that his receipts matched the regional benchmark data within normal variation, which was the data point he had needed and which had cost him to obtain 30 years of operating in a district where the check had not existed, and 2 years of knowing that the absence of the check had been the condition on which 20 years of systematic underpayment had relied. He was not bitter about the cooperative, which was the right institution for the right reasons. He was not bitter about the conviction, which was the right outcome for the evidence. He was something more specific than bitter, something he described as the particular kind of grief that comes from the loss, not of a person, but of a picture of a person, a picture he had been carrying for 40 years and that the investigation had replaced with a different picture, more accurate and less comfortable. The picture of a man who had understood the valley's infrastructure better than anyone, and had used that understanding for 20 years to take a little of what the valley grew, invisibly,
is now trying to close with varying resources and varying urgency and the shared
at the center of the district's economic life. Since before either of them was born, the Vickers family, Gerald and Margot Vickers, who had sold their farm in February of 2022 and moved into the rental house in the county seat, received in the spring of 2024 the outcome of the civil litigation that their attorney had filed on their behalf, a settlement with the estate of the Frauds Proceeds Fund and with the crop insurance company whose policy had been denied on the basis of Collister's false grade certification. The combined settlement amount was not disclosed publicly, but the Vickers attorney described it as sufficient to allow the family to reacquire property in the district, which Gerald and Margot elected to do, purchasing a smaller operation than the one they had. Sold 320 acres rather than 400, which was what the settlement allowed for after taxes and legal fees and the 4 years of rental costs and the opportunity cost of the years without the farm's income, all of which were accommodated imperfectly and incompletely in the way that civil settlements accommodate things. They cannot restore but can partially compensate, Gerald Vickers told the Victim Services Coordinator in a final conversation after the settlement was complete, that he was not going to try to describe what getting the farm back felt like, because it was not what getting the farm back felt like. That the farm he had sold was not the farm he had bought, because the farm he had bought came after everything that had happened between the selling and the buying, and that what he had bought was a farm, which was what he was, which was enough, and that the thing he intended to do with it was farm, and that what he intended not to do with it was spend the years he had left measuring the distance between what he had and what he would have had if the 2019 quality grade had been accurate, because that distance was real and was partly calculable and was also the kind of distance that farming toward it rather than grieving toward it was the only useful thing to do with, which was not a philosophy but a practice, and which was what he intended to practice in a field on the eastern plateau, visible from the elevator in a district where the weights are right now, and the grades are honest, and the comparison is run every quarter by a committee of neighbors who understand from everything the years between 1992 and 2023 produced, that the comparison is what the elevator is for. The scale ticket at the heart of the Collister case, underneath the ledger and the quality grades, and the insurance denials and the trust structure and the $4.1 million was a piece of paper. A scale ticket is a simple document, a printed form with fields for the date, the commodity, the gross weight, the tare weight, and the net weight, signed by the certifying official and countersigned by the farmer or driver delivering the load. It is the document that the grain elevator transaction depends on, the point at which the physical reality of the harvest, measured in pounds, becomes the legal basis for a payment denominated in dollars, and it is, like all such documents, exactly as reliable as the person who fills out the fields. Brent Collister filled out the fields accurately in the public copy and differently in the private ledger for 20 years, for 214 accounts, for a total adjustment of $4.1 million in an operation so clean and so consistent that the only discrepancy visible in the public record was a 7 of 10. Pattern in quality grades that a trained agronomist noticed by comparing the public record against regional data that was publicly available and that nobody in the district had previously thought to use as a check. The check cost Petra Howell a few hours of analysis on the kitchen table. In a drought year, the absence of that check had cost the district 20 years of adjusted payments, and 3 families their insurance and 1 family their farm. The check is now quarterly and independent and built into the cooperative's governance documents, where it will remain as long as the cooperative exists as the minimum that the Eastern Plateau District requires of any institution that holds its scale tickets, which is that the tickets be what they say they are, which is an honest record of what the harvest weighs in the building at the edge of town. In the valley that grows the grain, the valley, soft white wheat on the eastern Oregon Plateau has a specific quality in late summer when the heads are full and the color has shifted from green to the particular pale gold that harvest weather produces, and the fields from the elevation of the elevator tower are a landscape that the farming families of the Sutters Crossing District have been reading for generations, able to identify their own sections by the contour and the drainage pattern and the specific shade of the gold, which varies by variety and by soil moisture and by the 100 small factors that 30 years of farming a particular piece of ground teaches a person to see, in a way that no one who has not grown up reading that particular ground can quite learn from a book. The harvest comes in every fall, the same fields producing the same grain in amounts that the weather determines and the soil determines and the work determines, and the work is the part that the farmers control, and the work is what they do, and what the work produces arrives at the elevator and is weighed and graded and becomes a number, and the number is now what the harvest is worth, which is what the elevator was always supposed to tell them, and which it is now telling them every fall on a ticket that the cooperative's Oversight Committee will compare against the regional data in the next quarterly review, and which will match as it has matched for 2 years, and as the committee expects it to match, and as it should always have matched, and as it will, as long as the comparison is made, as long as the committee sits, as long as the oversight holds, which is the only honest answer to the question of how long, and which is long enough for now, which is what there is. The insurance system, among the regulatory responses to the Collister case, the one that the USDA's Risk Management Agency moved on most quickly was a review of its quality grade certification protocols for small grain crops, specifically the reliance on single licensed broker certification by one commodity facility. The review, conducted in coordination with the Oregon Department of Agriculture and 2 other state agricultural agencies that had flagged similar concerns, produced a finding that the single certifier created a conflict of interest vulnerability in markets where the certifying broker had a financial relationship with the downstream insurance outcome, a finding that had been understood theoretically in the agricultural insurance literature, but that the Collister case had made concrete in a way that the literature had not previously required anyone to act on. The RMA implemented, for the following crop year, a requirement for independent grade verification in single elevator districts where the certifying broker also held the storage contract for the insured crop, a requirement that added a small administrative cost to the insurance process, and that the RMA estimated would prevent, in the districts where it applied, the category of fraud the Callister case had documented. Whether that estimate was accurate would be known in time by whether the category of fraud the Callister case had documented appeared again in the districts the requirement covered. The requirement covered 47 districts across 9 western states. The Sutter's Crossing District was one of them. The requirement's existence there is the product of what happened there, and of the fact that what happened there was found, and documented, and prosecuted, and made into a case file that the RMA could read and act on, which is the path from harm to prevention that runs always through the record. The Oregon Department of Agriculture's Commodity Audit Division used the Callister case as the primary case study in its training materials for the audit protocols it revised in 2024, a revision that included a specific checklist item for the kind of comparison Petra Howell had performed, the cross-referencing of a single broker's quality grade certifications regional benchmark data over a multi-year period for a sample of client accounts. The checklist item is labeled, in the training materials, the Howell Check, a designation that the division's director said was informal and unofficial, but that the division's staff had adopted because it was the clearest shorthand for what the check was and where it had come from, which was a person sitting at a kitchen table in a drought year with her father's records and the extension services data and the specific professional training to understand what a discrepancy between them meant and what to do about it. Petra Howell was told about the designation by a colleague who had attended the training. She said when her colleague described it that she hoped the name would eventually be replaced by the name of the protocol itself, because the protocol was what mattered in the protocol was what would prevent the next Callister, and that attaching
identity
a name
is built
to it,
around
even a name, risked making it feel like the achievement of a person rather than the function of a system, which was the wrong frame, because the whole point of the check was to make the prevention systemic rather than dependent on the presence of a specific trained person in a specific drought year. Her colleague asked if she wanted to formally request that the name be changed. She said she did not, because it was the division's training materials and the division's choice, and because she did not think the name would last anyway once. The check became routine, which it would, because that was what checks did once. They were built into a system, which was become ordinary, which was the best thing a check could become, which was the thing she hoped the Howell check would eventually be, which was a routine thing that nobody thought about because nobody needed to think about it, because it was just the way the commodity audit worked year after year, quarter after quarter, in the valleys and plateaus of Oregon, where the grain grows and the elevator stands and the scale ticket is the document that the harvest becomes before it becomes a check in a farmer's account, which should match what the harvest weighs and grade at what the harvest is, which is what it does now in the districts where the check is run, which is more districts than before, which is the direction the right thing always travels, which is outward, slowly, from the place where someone finally looked, the Eastern Plateau in fall. The harvest in the Eastern Plateau district ends in September most years. The last truck running to the cooperative elevator in the afternoon light that the district's farmers call the September light, different from the July light and the August light in ways that require a person who has spent decades watching the light change across the same fields to describe, which is that it is lower and longer and has a particular quality of finality that the harvest itself produces, the awareness that this year's work is done and the year's accounting is about to begin. The accounting now includes a quarterly oversight report and an annual independent audit and a comparison against regional benchmark data and a certification by a committee of neighbors who have read the Collister case and who understand from reading it that the comparison is what the accounting requires, which is not what the accounting required before 2023, which is what it requires now, which is what it will require as long as the cooperative governs itself the way it has committed to governing itself, which is with the memory of what the absence of the comparison produced, held in the governance documents and in the training materials and in the howl check and in the scale tickets that match now every quarter in the building at the edge of Sutter's crossing where the harvest goes when the September light comes. Down across the plateau and the trucks pull up and the year's work is ready to be weighed. The 43rd client among the 214 accounts in Collister's private ledger, one had a history that the investigation found necessary to trace separately from the financial analysis because it contained a detail the forensic accountants flagged as anomalous even within the scheme's own internal logic. The account belonged to a farm operation called the Prentice Family Trust, which had been on the ledger since 2005 and which showed the same pattern of adjusted weights as all the others, except that the adjustments stopped in 2017 and the account was marked in Collister's ledger with a notation that the forensic accountants initially read as a customer code, but that when the investigators cross-referenced it against Collister's personal financial records, turned out to be a payment reference, a reference to a wire transfer from the Prentice Family Trust's operating account to a personal account Collister held under his wife's maiden name, a transfer of $11,000 made in December of 2017 and never repeated. Investigation traced the Prentice Family Trust to its current trustee, a woman named Helen Prentice, who had inherited the operation from her father in 2016 and who had, in 2017, hired an agricultural management consultant to review the operation's financial performance. The consultant, a woman named Diane Katz who worked out of Eugene and who had reviewed a number of Eastern Plateau operations in her career, had included in her review a comparison of the Prentice Trust's elevator receipts against regional benchmark data, a comparison she performed as a standard element of her operational review and that had, in this specific case, produced a discrepancy that she had brought to Helen Prentice's attention along with a professional opinion that the discrepancy was either the product of an equipment calibration issue at the elevator or something that warranted a direct conversation with the elevator operator. Helen Prentice had called Brent Collister, and Collister, understanding immediately what the conversation was, what it implied about the stability of his operation if pursued further, had proposed a settlement of the identified discrepancy in the form of a private payment framed as a retroactive correction for a billing error in the Prentice account, an amount he calculated to be approximately what the Howell check would eventually calculate. Across the years, the account appeared in the ledger. Helen accepted the settlement because she was new to the operation, because the amount was manageable, and because Collister had framed it as an administrative correction rather than a fraud admission, a framing she had accepted because there was no reason at the time not to. She had not reported the conversation or the payment to any regulatory body, because the settlement had resolved what appeared to be a billing discrepancy rather than a crime. When the investigation reached her in 2023, she provided the documentation for the 2017 consultant's report that had produced it, and when the investigators asked her why she had not pursued the matter further, she said, "Honestly, that she had not known that what she had found was the visible edge of something much larger, and that the settlement had closed the question in a way that felt, at the time, like the right resolution for a discrepancy of that size, and that she had not had the framework to understand that a man who settled a billing discrepancy with a private wire transfer in December of 2017 was doing so because he could not afford for the discrepancy to become a conversation with anyone who would ask the questions that Diane Katz had asked, and that the settlement was not a correction but a silencing, a very specific and very calculated silencing of the one thread that had come closest in 20 years of operation to producing the comparison that eventually undid the scheme. Diane Katz was interviewed by the investigation and confirmed the 2017 review in her findings. She said, when asked whether she had considered escalating the discrepancy beyond the client consultation, that she had not, because the client had resolved it and her professional obligation was to the client rather than to the regulatory system in the absence of evidence of a crime, which was the correct professional understanding of her position, and which was, in hindsight, the answer that explained why Collister's operation had survived 6 more years after 2017, because the one person who had found the discrepancy had given it to the person best positioned to make it go away quietly. And the person best positioned to make it go away quietly had done exactly that, with $11,000 in a story about a billing error, and the comparison that would have opened everything had closed, instead, on a wire transfer and a receipt and 6 more years of adjusted weights in a ledger in a cabinet behind a locked door in a building at the edge of Sutter's Crossing, Oregon, where the scale ticket said one thing and the private ledger said another. And the farmers brought their grain and trusted the number, and the number was wrong for 20 years, until a drought year produced a kitchen table conversation between a farmer and his daughter, who was home from her extension posting and who had her laptop open and who asked the question that the regulatory system had not required anyone to ask, and whose answer is in the Oregon criminal record, and in the USDAS regulatory revision, and in the RMAS single certifier policy, and in the training materials of the Oregon Department of Agriculture, where the check that found the answer is named, still after the person who performed it first, sitting at a kitchen table in a drought year, in a valley where the grain grows. And the elevator stands, and the comparison now runs every quarter, and will run as long as the cooperative stands, which is as long as the farmers stand, which is as long as the valley grows wheat, which is what it does, and what it will do, and what it has always done. The case file for State of Oregon v. Brent Collister is in the Wasco County Circuit Court Archive. It is 41 binders. Binder 1 is the private ledger. Binder 41 is the cooperative's governance document. The distance between those 2 binders is the distance between what the elevator was and what it is.
She stays for about an hour and then drives home, and she does not. The 4 lines are Exhibit 1.
That replaced them, all in the same archive, in the same county, in the same valley, where the grain still grows and the September light still comes down across the plateau the way it has come. Down across every harvest since the first farm was planted on the eastern Oregon plateau, and the first bushel was weighed and the first number was written, and the first farmer asked whether the number was right, which is the oldest question in agriculture and the most important one, and the one that Sutter's Crossing now has a better answer to than it had before, which is the answer that the oversight provides, which is yes. the number is right, which is all the farmers ever needed to know, and which they know now.